Well, thank you for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to this. This kind of this together was done by Rilo Santana. He and I were talking, and the way I remember the conversation, it was, gee, everybody knows a lot about the vines, the grapevines that came from Italy to California and Washington and Oregon. What about the olives? What's the story with olives? We don't hear any stories about olives. So Rilo looked around, found our speaker tonight, who's involved in a project with olive growing in Oregon, Heather Stoven. She's the well, I forgot her official title. Let me look it up. She's the extension horticulturist for Oregon. She helps a lot of the farmers, works with the farmers, and is involved in various projects to enable basically olives to grow better in this particular environment here. So I'm looking forward to what she has to say. So I think that's enough of an introduction, and I'll turn it over to you, Heather.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. Hopefully, can you all hear me? Okay, good, we get the thumbs up. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, does that all look good to all of you? Yes, okay, thumbs up. Excellent. So thank you for the introduction, Dan. As you said, I'm an extension horticulturist with Oregon State University. I'm located in Yamhill County, which is McMinnville, in case anyone is familiar with the wine region here within the Willamette Valley. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about olive cultivation, a little bit in the New World, but primarily in the Pacific Northwest. And so I'm going to get started now. All right, so as you're all probably aware, olives are an ancient crop. This is a photo that was taken in Nimes, France. This is at Pont de Garde, which is an ancient aqueduct from the Roman era. And Neil Bell, who is one of my collaborators on our project with olives, he and I went on a trip to southern France to collect some plants for a different project that we have with ornamentals, and we were also able to visit olives while we were there at the same time. So at any rate, we were able to take this photo of this ancient olive tree, which is supposed to be about 1,100 years old. So olives can live to be quite old. So in ancient times, olive oil was a trading commodity, and it was spread throughout the Mediterranean by Greeks and Phoenicians. And it was used as food. As you know, it's the olives can be brined, and then the oil is consumed as well. And it was also used in these times for cleaning bodies, for perfumes, fuel for lamps, and for religious rituals and medicine, amongst other things. And then, of course, olive branches are symbolic and are used to symbolize peace. So olives, there's a lot going on with olives, and they're, well revered. People, I think, kind of have strong feelings for the olive tree, and they're certainly beautiful as well, especially when you get trees this old. So a little bit about world olive production. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but olives are actually native to this area here around Turkey and Syria. And so that's kind of where they began and were noticed and started being cultivated about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And then during this time, they were spread throughout the Mediterranean world. As I mentioned, through trade, olive oil was quite valuable. So for the New World, Spaniards are who introduced the olive to Peru in the mid-16th century. And then Franciscan monks spread the olive oil or spread olives from there. And so they were spread off along with missions. And so in the late 1700s is when olives were planted in Southern California. And you can still see some of these older trees at some missions within California. So a little bit about California olive oil production or olive production. So prior to 1900s, most olives in California were grown for oil. But then about the year 1900, it was found that the oil that was produced here in the US wasn't really very competitive with oils that were produced in Europe. However, about this time, the California ripe olive curing method was developed. So people are probably familiar with canned olives, the mission olives that are black and come in the can. And so at this point, then California switched its production and they started growing more table olives, the mission olive. And then that has been kind of the mainstay of the California olive industry until about the mid 1990s, when a new production method was developed. And so they've developed the high density and super high density plantings. So there's this picture here that you can see. So they started planting the trees really close together. And so now everything is machine harvested. So they harvest by machine, they're pruning by machine, they do all of their practices with equipment, and that has made it's made the olive industry in California more competitive with those in Europe. So now, because of this new system, the amount of olives that are being grown for oil has consistently been increasing, and now it's up to 60% of the plantings. And so what they did is they had to kind of tear out what they had and then plant new trees with this new system. And then it's also, I think Arbequina is the main cultivar that's used with this new system and the super high density plantings. A little bit about California olives. So California grows about 95% of the olives that are grown in the US. So almost all of the olive production is in California. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is in a moment here. But when you look at worldwide production, this amount that the US production is only 1% of the world's olives. So really the US is just a drop in the bucket. But there's still 30,000 acres of olives grown in California. So if you think about that, and that's only 1% of the world's olive oil or olive production, there's a lot of olives grown out there. The world consumes about 3.2 tons of olive oil per year, Greece being the country that consumes the most olive oil at about 20 liters per person per year, versus here in the US, it's only about a liter per year. So, we have a ways to go in the US, I think, with kind of promoting olive oil and its benefits. And there are a lot of benefits in terms of health and, having those positive, the good fats that you hear about, good cholesterol and that sort of thing. So olives are definitely something that the US is trying to catch up on a little bit. So a little bit about other areas in the US that olives are grown. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen this map before, if we have any gardeners in the group. This is the USDA hardiness map. And what this map does is it shows it goes mostly by minimum temperatures. And I'm from Minnesota originally, so I grew up here in the Twin Cities. And so we were zone 4, I think it's 4A or 4B. So these are, if you're in North Dakota, Minnesota, these are very cold growing regions. So this map, it goes from zones 1 to, I don't know what this is, 12 or something like that down here, 14 maybe. And so in the US, our colder regions are up north. Olives are USDA zones, or they grow well in USDA zones 9 through 11. And so, and there's some that will grow in 8. And so the zones 9 are this kind of peachish color here. So you can see some here in California, which of course, these are some of the main areas where olives are grown. and then in Arizona, a little bit in southern Texas, and then as well in Florida. And then zones 8 are kind of these little beigey areas. So here we have the Willamette Valley, we have some areas up here in Washington. Another thing to note is that olives need chilling in the wintertime and for fruit production. So you may think to yourself, oh, well, zones 9 to 11, why aren't we growing olives in more tropical places or maybe more in southern Florida? And the reason why this doesn't happen is because it's not cold enough there in the wintertime. And so it's kind of a fine balance. You need some chilling for fruit production, but you don't want it so cold that you have damage to the trees, which I'll talk quite a bit about, since that's one of the major issues that we have in Oregon. But it's also a major issue in other parts of the country as well. So when you have, the olives are grown like in Georgia, and there's not a ton, really. The second largest state after California for olive production is Texas, and they're way far behind in terms of the amount of acreage produced. But so areas in southern Georgia, in I think it's more the northern Florida regions. So to kind of most of the olives outside of California are actually grown in zone 8. And so same thing, of course, here in the Willamette Valley. I would say Arizona is probably the exception to that. And so this kind of leads to some weather issues, which I will get to here as we talk about Texas. So does anybody remember what happened last February in Texas in terms of their weather? They had a major cold spell in February 2021. It was on the news. They had pipes bursting, they had power outages, all kinds of issues. And they had about 8 hours, from what I've corresponded a little bit with some extension individuals in Texas. And they had about 8 hours below 13 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite cold, especially for olives. And so they had, as a result of this, up to about 90% defoliation of their trees. And I haven't heard since last spring. They did have some damage to the trees, but I'm not sure. It takes a while for the cold damage to show up. And so, but I have a feeling they probably did not have a good harvest this last year. And I'm not sure if they had a lot of trees that just totally died as well. Most of the olives in Texas are grown in southwest of San Antonio. So that's kind of, they have about 1,500 acres in Texas in olives. But like I said, and you see that in other parts of the country too, in Georgia. It's like you can have these really Arctic cold spells that come through, and it really does a number on olives. So growing olives outside of California definitely has its risks. So bringing us back to the Pacific Northwest here, this is an olive orchard in Salt Spring Island, British Columbia. So I wish we had more Canadians with us this evening so we could celebrate this olive orchard, which is the furthest north olive orchard that I know of, although maybe somebody else can correct me if they know differently. So obviously there must be some sort of microclimate that's beneficial for growing olives up here. I've never been to Salt Spring Island, but Neil Bell, my collaborator, has been, and he sent these photos. So here's another photo of the orchard. They have their own mill there. One of the main things, of course, with the olives is after they're harvested, then they're processed right away in a mill, and the olive oil, the oil is then milled out of the olives. So they were able to this year have a milling of olive oil. And so Neil found the olive oil online, so they are selling it. It came at quite a price, I will say, but I'm guessing with the climate that is in Salt Spring Island, it probably costs a lot to produce the olive oil. So it makes sense. I mean, certainly it costs a lot more to produce olive oil in Oregon than it does in California as well. So I thought that was really interesting that indeed there are olives grown in Canada. So bringing us back to this climate map, which I showed you earlier about where olives are produced in the world. So they're produced between 45 degrees and 30 degrees both in the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. So there are olive growing regions in Chile, South Africa, and Australia as well. I am located, as I mentioned, in the Willamette Valley, which is pretty much right at 45 degrees. So we are definitely kind of in the northern end of where olives are produced, although there are also at least one olive growing region in Europe that is at a similar latitude as we are. So as I was talking about the cold temperatures that were experienced in Texas, just in general with olives, as I mentioned, they're generally like to be, zone 8, if for some cultivars, and mostly 9, a little bit higher than that. So if we get temperatures below 20 degrees, then that starts to kill the small branches of olives. And if you get to below 12 to 15 degrees, then you can have severe damage or death. And so we in the Willamette Valley typically don't get below 20 degrees in the wintertime. We just had a spell not too long ago, right before Christmas, where we did get to 20 degrees, and then we had the high for a full day of 25, and then it got back to 20 again, and then it kind of creeped its way back out of freezing temperatures. And so I'm kind of waiting to see. It sounds like there's a little bit of some damage in our olives in our trial that I'll talk a little bit more about as we go on, but I'm kind of waiting to see, since we had a longer period of time at cold temperatures. But it is trees that are more established and that have been in the field longer tend to do better at colder temperatures. If you do get temperatures below like 12, 15 degrees with a new tree, it can certainly kill it. But sometimes they will come back from the roots, especially if you have an older tree. So if any of you, I don't know if anyone has an olive or anything in your garden or anything like that, but now you kind of know what to watch out for. And it's important to kind of look for your microclimates. Or I have some olives in containers that I keep in my garden, more because I don't have a ton of space, and olive trees can get pretty big. So, and a lot of times we'll grow the olives more as shrubs in this region. And I'm going to show some photos from our olive production here in Oregon. And the reason that they're more shrubby is because when we get these cold events, they do get killed back. And so they tend to grow more easily as shrubs. So the olive orchards that are in Oregon here tend to be in the Willamette Valley. Olive production started about the year 2000 in our area. That's when the first orchards started. But like I said, they're mostly northern Willamette Valley. There's a lot of interest from southern Oregon and the Roseburg area. So we may start to see more in that area as well. And here's some photos of what these orchards look like. And so they tend to be, in general, kind of smaller orchards and newer for the most part, newer planting. Here's a photo of a ripe olive right before harvest. So these are harvested pretty much right before a frost, because we tend to harvest here more like beginning of November if possible. So basically growers will push back the harvest as late as possible. And then once there's a frost in the forecast, then they try and get everything harvested, because once you get a hard freeze, then that ruins the fruit. And so this is a picture of some really relatively nice ripe fruit. That's not always what they look like in our region. A lot of times that we don't get the ripening because we don't have as much heat as Europe or California or some of the regions where olives are grown typically. This is an orchard also that isn't irrigated. And so irrigating the crop, although it doesn't need irrigation in the Pacific Northwest, it certainly will help with fruit size and ripening a little bit. Here's some of the olives as they're harvested, some more of the green ones, and here's some that include a little bit more ripe olives. And it kind of depends on the season as well. I think the photo that I showed you earlier was from a couple of years ago when we didn't have quite as warm of a summer, but the last, we had, some warm years, especially 2021 was really warm. So we tended to see a little bit more ripening. This is a photo from Durant Vineyards. A lot of these operations are held with wineries, because it can be a tourist, agritourism, to have olive oil along with the grapes and with the wines. So here's a picture of the tasting bar that Durant has, and they are in Yamhill County, which is where I am, in Dayton, Oregon. And so they sell vinegars, and they sell olive oil and some other things, culinary items, in their tasting room or in their gift shop. And then you can also go to the tasting room and have wine. They have an Olio Nuovo festival every November. So they take the newly milled olives and sell that oil, which is it's especially green and fresh. It doesn't last as long, so that's the negative aspect of the Olio Nuovo. You have to use it within like 2 or 3 months, I believe. So you purchase it and it's great, but it can't be stored for any length of time. And then they also sell like the traditionally oil that's been in the casks a little bit long as well. And so they get thousands of people that come to this event every year and taste their olive oils. And so it's been very successful for them to be able to bring in people for this extra event for their winery and for the olive oil. So they grow both grapes and they grow olives as well. And they also have a nursery where they also grow plants. So you may ask yourself, why would you want to grow olives in some of these regions where it's probably a little risky to grow olives? Here's a picture of a tree that has cold damage. So this is what happens after it gets too cold and you get temperatures below 20 degrees, you have this tip die back. And so there's a lot of risks with growing olives, kind of in the northern range of where they want to grow. And one of the reasons that people have done so is because actually Oregon produces really high quality olive oil. And so this olive oil here is award-winning in a national competition. So that's exciting. A lot of interest also has come to be because of climate change. After having events like the heat dome and getting to be 114 degrees here, people want to know, what can we grow in our changing climate? And so a lot of people ask about it then. Olives are very drought tolerant. As I mentioned, a lot of the farmers do irrigate olives here, but it's not going to be as much as you would irrigate something else, if you're to have other types of crops. So it is they are drought tolerant plants that don't use a ton of water. So I have a lot of growers. I also work with small farmers, and they'll purchase land and they want to know what they can grow if they don't have water rights or that sort of thing. So olives have been an option there. So in response to the interest of farmers to growing olives, I worked with a team and still work with a team on the Olea research project. And it started in 2017, and we had Western SARE grant funding in order to look at different aspects of production for farmers. And so we were looking at propagation techniques, so growers could grow their own olives. We were looking at timing of when people should plant their olives. And then one of the main projects, and one that we're continuing on, I'll talk a little bit more about, is cultivar evaluation for cold hardiness. Because as I mentioned, one of the major issues is that it's cold here, colder than the olives probably would like. And so as part of this, we did a survey over between 2018 and 2020, and we're looking at aspects of growers and what kind of production practices they have. And then we also wanted to know about the challenges of growing olives in Oregon. So from this, we were able to kind of get a good idea of what is happening in the industry locally. Here's some more pictures of the sites that are grown locally. Another thing that I didn't really mention is that a lot of these sites are grown on hills, and it's good to have, or on slopes. Also, south-facing slopes are good because we want that extra heat. And the reason for a slope is because the cold air can kind of go down the hill and not be sitting where the olive trees are, because if you have that cold air pooling right where the trees are growing, you're going to have more cold damage. So south-facing slopes is where a lot of people at least attempt or want to have their olives, although not everybody has that unique site. So as part of our survey, we found that most of the growers are in Marion, Polk, and Yamhill County. So that's kind of up in this region. So that kind of 45 parallel is kind of right here at Salem. So this is kind of where all the growers are located in our area. And most growers have small operations. So there's, this one is 10 to 15 acres. There's a few that are 5 to 10 acres, but most of the growers have less than 5 acres of olive. So it's really small in Oregon and just kind of starting out. And there's a wide variety of cultivars represented, 41 from the survey, and we didn't survey, of course, every single olive grower. So these are, we had, I think, 13 of the olive growers responded to our survey. And amongst those 13 growers, 41 different cultivars are grown. So a lot of people are trying to figure out what is the best cultivar to grow in our cooler climate. And so they're kind of, throwing everything at the wall to try and see, okay, is this the best one? Is this the best one? And the way they've been doing it is just, you kind of plant a row of one kind, and then maybe the next year you come across something else, then you would plant a new cultivar. And so it's kind of a mishmash of a whole bunch of different things. However, the most common cultivars are Arbequina, Frantoio, Licino, and Pendolino. So these last three are all Italian cultivars. But as you can see here, there's a whole bunch of other cultivars out there, from Aglandao and Coratina, Mission, a whole bunch of different things. So as I mentioned, we did a survey looking at what was the biggest issue, and number one was winter cold issue, or winter cold injury. So as I mentioned, we did a study looking at this, and this is a picture of an orchard that was hit particularly hard by cold, and you can see all the dead branches. So we're trying to look at if there's some different cultivars that we could grow that would do better in our 8B climate zone. And olive cultivars do vary, and unfortunately, information on relative cold hardiness isn't really well known. There's some information in the literature, but it's more about, like, this is a study that was looking at like branch samples that they would put into different freezing temperatures, and it's just not as applicable as we would like. And there's also all kinds of information out there about like frost damage to blooms. And that's not really an issue here in the Pacific Northwest, because by the time we get into spring, we have a cooler spring than you would have in other Mediterranean climates. And so we don't bloom here in Oregon until like mid-June, even late June. So we don't really have an issue with freeze on blooms like they do in other parts of the world or parts of California. And this picture here kind of shows, this is when olives bloom in California. So it's kind of late April into May. And so if you were to have a late freeze, maybe into April, you might kill those flower buds or something like that. So like I said, there just isn't a lot of information in the literature for us to look at, but there was a freeze event in 1990, and it was documented in a publication. And so we were able to see a little bit about which cultivars are most resistant to a temperature of 15. And so these are some of the things that we have in some of our trials. We were able to look at susceptible Arbequina, as I mentioned, is one of the more commonly grown olives, although it's tended to be a little bit more hardy than some other ones. But these ones that were very susceptible, other than Koroniki, I don't think a lot of these are really grown. Boutillan perhaps are grown too much in this region. So we're able to look at some of this information, as well as information from cooler olive growing regions in other parts of the world. So as I mentioned, Neil and myself were in southern France for another plant collecting trip. So we decided at the same time to go up to Nyon and look at the olives that they have up there. So that's 44 degrees north, so not quite as far north as we are in Oregon. Here's a picture from the site. They grow Tanche is their main olive, as well as Aglandau, and we have Aglandau in Oregon, but we do not have Tanche. So the thing is that we can't bring in olive cultivars from from Europe, because they have quarantines on that plant material. And they're worried about diseases coming to the US as well as insects. So the quarantine is actually specifically for a borer. I think it's a citrus borer that they don't want to come into the US. So we can't get plant material from Europe, or olive plant material from Europe, because there is a germplasm repository in Spain that we would love to be able to get more cultivars from, but unfortunately they do have a rule that you can bring it here, but then you have to destroy it afterwards, so that kind of defeats the purpose. So another spot that Neil has been to that is a big olive growing region that's further north is in Garda, Italy, and they're at 45 degrees north. And so I don't know if any of you in this group have been there. It looks lovely. I wish I could have been on that trip. So even though this has the same latitude as the Willamette Valley where I am at, definitely does not look like the Willamette Valley. So it's definitely looks more tropical than what we have. There's all these palm trees. Quite a large amount of olives are grown there. Casaliva is the most common cultivar of olive grown at that site, or at that location. This is a photo from a research site that is in Lake Garda, and it is called the Mock Institute. And so they have done some research there into more cold hardy cultivars, and they have found the following here, like Carolea, Coratina, Grignon, Etrana, Lachino. So some of these are already being grown in the Pacific Northwest. Some of these we may not, I haven't heard of this one, that we may not have access to that. It might not be in the US, but we're able to, gather some information from what they've seen at this latitude, and, use some of these in our research as well. So Neil put together this really neat chart here, and it's looking at degree days by location. And so what degree days are is they're looking at, it's a measure of heat accumulation. So this is basically taking the daily average temperature. So it'll take the day's high and it'll take the day low, add them together, and then they subtract it from what's called a base temperature, which is kind of a temperature with the plants or insects. This is used in insects a lot too, where they're not developing anymore. So by this, you're able to look at basically over time, how much heat are you getting, and how much are the plants in this case growing, or how much time do they have to grow each year. So this is the annual degree days. So how much temperature units have they had over the year? So Cordoba, Spain, where a lot of olives are grown, they have 5,000 heat units. Florence, 4,000. So Nyon, where Neil and I went, 2,700. Lake Garda was 3,200. So even though it's further north than a place like Nyon, it still has more heat units because of that unique microclimate that they have there by the lake. So Austin, Texas, even though, so they have the most heat units here, but as I mentioned, they still have problems growing olives in Texas, because they do have a lot of heat, in the wintertime as well, but they, southern Texas doesn't get cold enough, but northern Texas gets too cold and they have these cold spells. So this doesn't necessarily tell all of the story. Corning, California, where a lot of olives are grown, pretty similar to Cordoba, Spain. And then here in Oregon, Roseburg in Southern Oregon is kind of similar to Neon, but Salem, Oregon, near where I am at, is way less heat units. And so that's why we, have had issues with ripening and that sort of thing, because even though we are at that 45-degree mark, it's just, we have such a mild, climate with the coastal influence that we still don't get the heat units that some of these other places do. This is just some, looking at generally, kind of talking about what I was saying, generally we have pretty mild temperatures, as you're aware. I'm sure you have similar in Seattle as well. Last winter, the coldest temperature we had was 21 degrees. And this was also the year of the heat dome. So we had 114, but, pretty unusual. So you can see mostly 80s up to 90s in the summertime. So kind of getting back to our story about the trial, looking at the different cultivars in Oregon, trying to find one that is going to handle the cold a little bit better. We worked with the National Clonal Germplasm Repository, which is in Davis, California. And this is where most of the genetic material and different, they have a scion block here. So they have all these trees of different types of cultivars of olives at this site. So we're able to request from them and say, we would like to get cuttings of all these olives. We can bring them back and propagate them here in Oregon. And so unfortunately, they have a limit of you can only get 30 different cultivars per year. So it took us 3 years, I think, to get everything they had in their germplasm repository, but we were able to do it over time. And we planted those in stock blocks and kept some in pots as well, because part of this study is that in order to be able to fully assess which cultivars do best in our climate, you have to have plants of the same size and same age planted in the field. So if we planted the olives that were collected and rooted back in 2017, right next to the ones that were collected and rooted in 2019, you'd have some plants that were older than others, and it wouldn't be a very good comparison. So we had to go back in 2019, take cuttings again off of all of the plants that we had received earlier, and then add these to some Lebanese origin olives that we got that actually came from a grower in Texas. And then we propagated all of them at the same time in 2019. And so this is kind of what it looked like when we were propagating all those olives. We then, all of those that were rooted on were grown on in 2020 until they were in a 1-gallon pot. And then we prepared our site. So this is located at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center, which is in Aurora, Oregon, which is, I think, 25 miles south of Portland. As you notice, we do have a flat site. Mostly it has a little bit of slope to it, but nothing major. So we may experience more issues here than if we had our south-facing slope site, which we don't have at our research station, unfortunately. We prepared the field. We put this black weed mat in there. And so that's really helpful for a couple of reasons. One, for, of course, keeping weeds down. And then also it helps with the black, accumulates the heat. So a lot of growers also will have this black mat. And so that's helpful for ripening of olives and that sort of thing. So this is what our plot looked like. We had 4 replicates of every single plant. So we had like 4 Aglandau, and we had 4 Mission, and we had 4 of everything that we collected so that we can replicate everything in the field. And then it's randomized. So we put, some would be here and here, scattered throughout the field. So if there was something that happened in a particular spot, maybe a gopher went crazy and, chewed 4 in a row, you don't lose all of them, and you can compare a little bit better when you look at the data. So we did 4 plants randomized. We do irrigate our plot. Especially, unfortunately, we had intended on planting this sooner in the year, but this actually got planted in July of 2021. And so it was important to irrigate as we first planted, and we're probably going to be cutting back on irrigation this year now that it's been established in the field a couple of years. This is after planting, and this is what the plot looked like this fall. And we did a field day out here, invited growers out to look and compare at the different cultivars. There's some here with some fruit on them. So we're starting to see a few things happening here. So we have 118 different cultivars, so 118 different olives that we're looking at. So we were able to get quite a few different things. I mean, there's so many, I mean, there's hundreds of different olives that are out there. And like I said, we're not able to get olives from Europe. So there's, you know, all other olives out in Europe that we can't have in our trial at this point in time, but we're still able to look at quite a few different ones. As I mentioned, it's randomized and replicated. And then we are looking at the growth, flowering, and the yield, and then the cold hardiness as well. And so we've been able to start collecting data this last year, even though it's kind of, the plants have been in the field for a year and a half now. We had our low temperature, as I mentioned, of 21 degrees last January 1st of 2022, and we did see damage. So here's kind of a close-up of what that looked like. So we had, you know, if you consider we had 118 different cultivars, these were the ones that were the worst. There was a number that didn't have any damage at all. So we're starting to see some differences with the different varieties of olives that we have. Here's another picture of a tree that was affected more from the cold. We also looked at flowering because, of course, you know, hopefully with plants being more floriferous, they may be more likely to have fruit or produce more fruit, because of course that's going to be really important to our growers. Olives are wind pollinated, but you do need different pollinizers. You need to have either pendolino is a pollinizer that's used really commonly, or you need to have a mix of different olives in the field. Because if you have just all of one kind of olive, then they don't tend to pollinate very well and produce fruit, and they tend to not be very self-fertile either. So it's best to have a grouping of either a few different cultivars or a couple with a pendolino if you are going to grow olives and you are interested in fruit. Some that we found had a lot of fruit set. Arbequina, which is really commonly grown here. Arbosana is as well. A couple others that aren't as common here in Oregon. This is the olive harvest that we did this last year. We found that some fruit tended to be much larger, like this Giarafa, and this is one that probably isn't going to be real hardy here based on what I showed you in that California cold event. So, but this is the cultivar that produced the largest fruit, but this is the fruit that was harvested. Like I said, it's only been 1 year. So, you know, it takes 5-6 years really for the trees to become, to be harvesting, you know, a lot more fruit. But you can see that they produced large fruit, but there weren't very many of them. Versus this Mixani, which is something that hasn't really been grown in Oregon, but it produces a lot of fruit, but they're really small. So this one might not be the best option for olive production, but we'll see what happens. Licino is something that's grown really commonly around here now, and so it has, you know, larger fruit and it's starting to ripen, but not as much fruit production as, you know, something like Mixani. So a couple other things, as I mentioned kind of in the beginning, I was going to talk a little bit about insect pests. The other thing I was going to mention is harvest, which is a major issue as well for growers. So when I talk to people and people call me on the phone and they say, hey, I'm kind of interested in growing olives, one of the things that I bring up is that olives are hand harvested, at least in Oregon. We don't have enough olives to use mechanical harvesting like they're doing in California. And plus, since the olives don't get as ripe here, they don't tend to, you know, pull off of the tree very easily. So it takes some work to, as you're harvesting these trees, to pull those olives off and harvest them. So here, what a lot of the growers will do, like I said, is a lot of people have small acreages, 5 acres or less. And so they tend to kind of have a potluck. They'll have some bottles of wine. They'll, you know, have some really good food. And then they invite their friends to come and pick olives and keep their fingers crossed that they don't have some terrible rainy weather. And like I said, this tends to be right at the end of October into November, while watching the forecast and hoping for, not a cold, hard freeze. This is at Durant Vineyards. For them, they have the vineyards, and so they do have some workers that they can have help to harvest the olives. They have more acreage at that site than a lot of the other growers in Oregon. They also, I don't have a photo of it here, but they also have there's like some vibrating kind of, they're like something you can hold in your hand and it kind of vibrates, and that helps to shake off some of the olives. So they have used those a little bit. So they can use those. And then they have these nets, and these are used in Europe, at least in my experience when I was over there as well, that you can shake into these nets, and then you can collect the nets and put them in the bins. So this technique is also used as well. So the last issue that I'm going to talk about for Oregon growers is the emerald ash borer. And this was just found in Forest Grove, Oregon, for the first time on the other side of the mountains. And it's going to be a major issue just in general. So I don't know if any of you are from the eastern US or the Midwest, but the emerald ash borer was found or introduced from, I think it's a Asian pest or an Asian beetle. And it was found originally in 2002 in Michigan, and it has spread throughout the eastern and Midwest since this time. It is now found in 30 states and has destroyed millions of ash throughout the country. It has been, as I wrote here, America's most destructive forest pest. And so this was found last summer in Forest Grove, which is probably only about 15 miles from some of the olive groves that we have in Oregon. And this pest also has been found in research to be a pest of olives, as well as ash, which is what this pest normally feeds on. But olives and ash trees are really closely related. And so there's a researcher in Ohio who was kind of thinking about this and decided to try out what would happen if the emerald ash borer and olives were to meet. So in a laboratory, he did some research. He found that indeed emerald ash borer can complete its life cycle in olives. And so that we don't exactly know what's going to happen in real life yet, but it's definitely, I think, going to cause a problem, and at least some branch dieback and death. It's not the preferred host of the emerald ash borer, but they've never been really together in real life yet. So there's the areas where olives are grown, there hasn't really been much emerald ash borer establishment. So we'll see what happens here in Oregon. And then it's, I'm sure, going to spread as well. So we have Oregon ash as a native tree here, and that also spreads up to Washington and down to California. So I think eventually this is going to also be an issue for California olives. And it's, native ash throughout the West Coast is going to be impacted by this pest. So what happens is the adults will lay eggs on the trees. The larvae will develop under, and it's a borer, so it develops under the bark and the cambium layer. So under where the water is moved and where the nutrients are moved, they bore and cause girdling and disruption of that process, which will kill the trees. And there isn't a way to really stop this pest. And so the Oregon Department of Agriculture at this point, is reporting where it's located, but there's not really a lot they're going to be able to do to stop the pest. So this is what it looks like in Toledo, Ohio, after emerald ash borer was established. And this basically was a nice tree-lined boulevard, and now the trees are dead. So it's going to be very sad here in the Pacific Northwest soon as well. So with that, I guess we're not exactly sure how this is going to impact growers in our region. When people call me now and tell me that they're interested in growing olives, I have to tell them and say, we just don't know what the impact is going to be. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to treat the trees. Borers are really difficult to treat. In landscapes, you can inject your trees with insecticides, but in natural areas, the trees just basically are kind of on their own and eventually will succumb to the borer. And so there isn't a treatment yet for olives because it's never really been an issue before. So it's kind of hard to say how this borer is going to impact Oregon olives and to be honest, in the future, California olives as well. And so that is the end of what I have. And I don't know if I can't see I don't know if I should stop sharing. I can't see the Q&A box. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat or if people just want to unmute and ask questions, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have to the best of my ability.
Why don't we unmute and ask our questions as they come up? And that should work really well.
Great.
So this is Rilo, and I've got some questions to lead with.
Sure.
So I'm actually, hang on, where did Heather go?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. So thank you for, this is as interesting as I'd hoped it would be. And I live in Vancouver, I live in BC. I really do envy you folks and your outreach because I'm a master gardener and we just don't have the outreach here in Canada that you folks have with your universities. So pollination, I'm glad you brought that up. And so olives are wind pollinated, but can they also be hand pollinated? So if someone has a garden and they've got a couple of olive shrubs, can they hand pollinate?
I suppose you could. I don't know that it's ever, I mean, I haven't read about it being done before. I mean, you'd want to have pollen from another kind of olive tree. So if you were to just have your one olive tree and try and, brush the pollen onto the other blooms, that wouldn't really be effective.
No.
So you'd need to have pollen from a different kind of olive.
So then,
I mean, I suppose technically you probably could hand pollinate it. They do produce quite a bit of pollen, which often wind pollinated trees will do or plants will do. But yeah, it's
so then somebody would have to think about planting a few plants. If they just have a yard and a south-facing wall, for example, they just have to think about planting the right types of olives side by side so that they can increase pollination.
Right, exactly. And I think in general, other than Pendolino being a pollinizer, so if you were to have, only one type of tree and you were to choose one other one, the Pendolino would be it. But at the same time, there's some orchards that don't really have much Pendolino because they might have 10 different kinds of olive trees. And so if you have that situation where you have a whole bunch of diversity, I don't think it's necessary to have a specific pollinizer because Pendolino in itself isn't necessarily the best producing tree. It's just put in there more because it's good at pollinating the trees so that you get good fruit on the other producers.
Thank you. So was that somebody
else?
else?
Ask a question? Is that possible? Because I have a question. I want to go back up to a basic idea of what's going on with olive production. I know that you said in California, most of the olives were grown not for olive oil, but for eating. Are most of the olives in Oregon being planted for olive oil, or also are they being planted for eating?
Yep. And so, yeah, it's switching now. And actually most in California are being produced for oil, but that's kind of a new production. But yes, in Oregon, there are some that are being grown as table olives. Most are grown for oil. There's only one commercial mill at this time, although there's another one being put in Southern Oregon as well. And so that's one of the issues as well, is that with the one mill, it gets to be kind of complex in terms of getting your oil in, because everybody's harvesting at this, or getting your olives into the mill because everybody's harvesting at the same time. Some growers will go in together and they'll kind of, put all their olives together and mill it together, and they can sell it to the mill to be included in their oil, or a lot of growers will want to have their own label, their own olive oil label, in which case, the mill also has a minimum, so you have to have enough olives to meet the minimum. But yes, most olives produced in Oregon are used for oil.
Heather, when in propagation, do you use a common stock to graft onto, or are they all unique cultivars?
So in Oregon, what we've done, so I think traditionally olives are own rooted. I did see in France some that were grafted, and they tended to graft actually the pollinizers onto the tree. So they had some of those branches, but I think for the most part, and specifically here in Oregon, they're own rooted. So you would take a cutting of Arbequina and you would root that, and then you would have that growing, and you wouldn't have a root stock like you might have with other types of trees. And one reason that you'd want to do that here in Oregon is because of the cold. So if you get your tree to die back because of a cold winter or cold freeze, if you had it on a rootstock and it wasn't, the cultivar that you want, then you wouldn't end up with that cultivar, if that makes sense. So for us, it makes sense. And I think even in California, I think a lot of times they're propagated and they're own rooted. A lot of times too, tissue culture can be used if, for large quantities of olives as well.
We have a question in the chat from someone. Can olives be, wait, it got lost there. Can olives be grown from the pit or only propagated from cuttings?
So they can. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that does, they will definitely grow. I haven't tried to grow them from seed before. The thing with doing that is you don't really know what you're going to get, because, same thing with if you were to plant an apple seed, it's not going to be your Honeycrisp, or it's not going to be your Jonagold, because you have that pollination happening. Maybe if you only have, your one olive tree, then I guess you kind of know, but then you probably aren't really going to have fruit on it anyways, because it's not really pollinated. But yes, you can grow an olive tree from, the fruit. It just isn't going to necessarily be your Arbequina or your Licino, or what you particularly want. So you don't really know what you're going to get, so to speak, what cultivar it's going to be.
Another question in the chat. Thank you. Olive trees, do the olive trees or bushes need to be fertilized, and what would be the best food for those trees?
Sure. So generally they're not heavy feeders. They do like a more basic pH. So the soils that we have in the Willamette Valley are heavy, they tend to be clay, and we have pretty acidic soils here. So it's not really the best for olives. Generally, in the regions that they're native to, it tends to be basic soil like limestone, poor rocky soils, that sort of thing. So a lot of growers here will plant kind of up on berms a little bit, especially if they have poor soils, because you don't want to have the plants rotting, or they tend to get root rot pretty easily. And so definitely, if you have a way to, have it, your trees in more sandy soil, or, in a raised area. And I'm not really sure what the soils are like up in the Seattle region. But for us, it's definitely a region, but they don't tend to need a lot of fertilizer, because here our soils are really rich. They're, with clay soils have nutrients that are very available for plants. And so if you were to fertilize them, or you're to grow in like a soilless medium, citrus fertilizer is what's recommended for them, but they don't need particularly high rates of fertilizer, especially if they're planted in the ground. They tend to to do pretty well. So, they may need some nitrogen, but you don't want to over fertilize them either, especially as you go into the winter, because you don't want to encourage that new growth. If you're encouraging them to grow, in October, then that soft growth is more likely to be burned in cold temperatures.
Thank you. We've got two more in the chat. One is, how long does it take the trees to recover from a cold injury? And go with that one first.
Sure. So it kind of depends, I guess, on how much cold injury. If you have just some tips that are burned, like in some of the pictures that I showed, like from our research from last year, it will recover. I'm sure you wouldn't even be able to find the damage by now or by last fall. So it'll grow out of it pretty quickly. Olives have, they put on quite a bit of growth. We found that our trees grew a lot over this last year. And so if you just have some tip injury, it's going to grow out of fast. But if you have a tree that, you had major branch dieback, then that's going to take significantly more time. And then you're going to lose that wood that was going to produce fruit as well. And so you're going to, probably be at a loss for your crop for a couple of years, depending upon how severe things were.
And the next question is, the Medford area too hot for olive cultivation?
No, the Medford area is not too hot. They don't have a lot of olive cultivation there, but I think they may have some colder temperatures. I know they've had some issues in the Roseburg area, even more so than we have in the Willamette Valley, that they've had some early sudden freezes that have caused loss from those particular trees. So if you do have a sudden freeze, you haven't harvested yet, you're going to lose those olives. And so I think the issue with Medford isn't the heat, but I think there's maybe more potential for cold.
Next question in the chat also echoes what I was going to ask. How does the taste of the oil or the olive compare between the same cultivar grown in Europe as what might be grown in Oregon?
Yep. So I guess I could just say generally what's grown here in Oregon is going to, they have a very kind of spicy, peppery taste to them. And it has a lot to do with the fact that they're greener here when they're harvested. They definitely are unique climate, and our soils do kind of change the flavor. So I think it will taste different if you were to taste an Oregon olive oil versus, something of the same cultivar that's grown in Europe. So I think there will be a flavor difference. But I think here they tend to be grassier, they tend to be peppery, but our climate does change what they taste like.
Rilo, I'm going to have you ask that question yourself because I don't want to try to translate. I'm not sure what you meant. Go for it.
Okay, hang on. So what year wood do the olives grow on? So is it last year's growth? Because like trees, like fruit trees can sometimes be 2 years old. So
Yeah,
I'm thinking more lines, if someone has their own plants in their own garden, then pruning, you need to think about how many years ahead that's affecting your crop.
Right. Yeah. So they are going to be fruiting on last year's wood. So, but a lot of times the olives aren't going to need a ton of pruning in our region just because they don't have, quite as much growth as you would have in other climates. And you kind of want that growth here because that will, give you more fruit production. The one thing that growers do prune for is just to let in more light. And so they may prune out a little bit in the center of the tree. And so they don't tend to necessarily, just prune the new wood, but they're going to, prune some more major branches to just kind of get light into it, just like you would do with other fruit trees as well. And so it's not really there isn't a lot of information about that. I think growers kind of do what, they kind of have their own practices for pruning. We haven't been able to look into pruning yet with our research. And so we don't really have kind of university recommendations about how to prune yet for on the Pacific Northwest, but I guess in general, they don't get a lot of heavy pruning, and it tends to be just to kind of open it up a little bit to get some light into the canopy.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Dom Sportelli. You want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. A couple of things. In Italy, at least in our experiences, they have a fly infestation almost annually, and they do spray, and I think it's a copper-based spray or a copper component of the spray. And I wonder if they experience anything like that in this country.
Yes, so in California, the olive fruit fly is a huge pest, and it's a major issue down there. We don't have it in Oregon, so I think I put in one of my slides that, one of the benefits of growing olives in Oregon is that there aren't a lot of pests, and that was the case until now. We're going to have the emerald ash borer, which, like I said, we haven't found in olives yet, and it was just found last year in forest grove and ash trees, but it will become an issue. But olive fruit fly, which is a major issue in Europe, as you mentioned, and then in California, it is not in Oregon.
One other question. You mentioned in your test plot having gophers.
Mhm.
And is there any variety that they like better than another?
No, they like it all. Yeah, both gophers and voles we've had issues with, and they like that ground cloth, as I mentioned, which is good for, attracting heat and, help with ripening of the plants and development of the plants, but it's also very attractive to, ground dwelling vertebrates that want to hide from predators and that sort of thing. But no, I don't think they really care which olive, and I don't think they're necessarily, feeding on, they probably are feeding on some of the roots, but it's just, just their tunneling and everything is really can be a major issue, but I think it's not necessarily cultivar dependent.
You were saying most of the plantings were on flat ground. Has anybody really experimented with hills in that area?
Yeah, so our plot is on mostly flat ground, but actually most growers have their plants or their trees or their orchards on hills, on south-facing slopes. That's really the best site because, the south-facing is going to be warmer, and then with the slope, the cold air can drain away from the trees or from the orchard and go to a lower lying area. So no, or definitely sloped pieces of land are actually where most of the olives are grown.
You mentioned Medford and Roseburg. Now, is there any consideration because of the fact they're a little higher altitude wise and probably get a little colder?
Right, they're warmer in general in the summertime, but in the wintertime, as I mentioned, they have had some cold issues as well. The site that's the largest in that area is right near the Rogue River. And so it could be that they have a little bit of, influence from the river, and it might not get quite as cold at their site. But yeah, definitely, like I said, I think that's one of the issues with Medford. They have more heat units down there, but I think in Southern Oregon, they do have some issues with cold as well.
Couple more questions in the chat. One, are there nurseries in Willamette Valley with available olive stock for home growers?
Yes, so there are a couple out there. As I mentioned, Durant, they have a nursery, Red Ridge Nursery, that they grow quite a few different kinds of olives. There's also, I'm trying to think of the name of it right now. There's One Green World, which they have all kinds of really unique fruit trees of all types. So they don't just have, they have olives, but they also have all kinds of really unique plants. So that would be another place to look. So there are a few out there if you were to look for olive trees. Like I said, I'm concerned now with the emerald ash borer. If you're going to get a tree from Oregon, you might want to do it sooner rather than later, because once I think the emerald ash borer makes it to these places, they're going to be quarantined and they're not going to be able to ship olives they might be able to have some treatments that are done, but short term, I guess I'm not exactly sure, what's going to happen with those that grow olives and then where to ship them, because it's going to be a quarantine issue.
Thank you. And then last one I see in the chat, my olive tree produces tons of flowers, but never gets as big as the ones you showed, and then they die.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure why they don't. I mean, it could be too that the photo that I took, that was closer up or something like that. I'm not sure if or it could just be cultivar specific, that the one I took photos of, that cultivar has a little bit larger flowers. They don't tend to flower forever. So I guess, I don't know if you're trying to grow them for fruit and you're not getting it, and it could be a pollination issue. I guess I'm not really sure. I mean, yeah, they tend to, produce a lot of flowers. But yeah, I don't think they flower for, a huge length of time. So it may just be that, they're just senescing and, they don't bloom for weeks or anything by any means.
So here we go. One more question in the chat, and we'll make this the last one. Several years ago, someone was selling olive trees at Festa Italiana, bought one and tried to winter it in the greenhouse, but it died anyway. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of hard to say. It could be, they can be sensitive to root rot, as I mentioned. So it could be that the roots were kept too wet. I'm not, like I said, I don't know what the winter temperatures were, or if you heat your greenhouse or anything. I mean, I would think in general, it should be okay, but also plants that are in containers, they can have root death at a higher temperature than something that's in the ground, if that makes sense, because those roots are more exposed because they're in a container. And so it could be that if that plant was in the ground and it was 20 degrees, it would survive. But if the container, if your greenhouse isn't heated and, it's in a container, it could be that, the cold that was exposed to those roots still caused the tree to die. But without knowing the specifics of the situation, it's kind of hard to say what happened. But it could be that containerized plants, are more sensitive to cold. And then they, like I said, they can be sensitive to root rot in containers too.
Consensus may be that they were bad plants being sold. So Dan, are you there?
I'm here, and I want to thank Heather very much for, well, given the number of questions, you can tell it was a fascinating presentation. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Heather.
you're welcome. Yeah, hopefully.
And a little.
Yeah, I'm not
after you.
super familiar with your group, so hopefully I was able to kind of meet what your expectations and what you were looking for.
Oh, this was
about olives.
Well, I think you did. There were
Fabulous. Yeah.
lots of questions and things like that.
Well, hopefully it sounds like there's some olive growers in the group, so I'm really excited to hear that. So hopefully you've learned a few
Yeah,
things
there you
to
go.
help you.
Will you
We'll
pass?
have to watch out for the emerald ash beetle.
Yeah, the emerald ash borer, I mean, like I said, it's going to be an issue in, water like wetlands and, anywhere. I'm worried about salmon and salmon habitat, because I think you also have the Oregon ash, in your wet areas in Washington as well. So yeah, unfortunately, it's also probably coming your way. So.
Oh,
Will you please send through Dan or me, will you send us information about that tasting event that takes place with the new oils? Because
Yeah.
I will get that information out to our membership. Who knows who might get in the car and go drive and be part of that. That'd be cool.
Yeah, it's a really fun event, and they have, that's where the mill is here in Oregon. So they'll give tours and tell you about the mill, and then you can learn about the oils, and yeah, it's a fun event.
It would be fun to go to, wouldn't it?
And you can buy plants there too. Like I said, they
Yeah,
have all kinds of
I'm
plants.
thinking road trip.
Yeah, road trip.
road trip, a definite road trip. That's
Yeah.
Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, you're
Thank
welcome.
Thank you all. Before you leave,
Yeah, it was nice to meet
Thank
all
you
of
so much. It was a
Dan,
I
fantastic.
just want to tell you about
Yeah, Dan will tell us about our next meeting.
The next meeting is 2 weeks from today, and it's a meeting in Italian. It's the speaker's been here before, Professor Sergio Amato from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He's a retired professor of Italian from there. And this time he's going to talk about Italian politics and the rise of populism in Italian politics. Talk about what do you call it? A contemporary subject here, and especially about the role of the media in the rise of populism in Italian politics. Anyway, that's 2 weeks from today. Same procedure. You'll get a message from Joyce, our president, and a chance to pre-register. So anyway,
I
Thank you all
actually-
so much.
I have one more question for Heather. So this is something I tried asking up here in Canada about anyone who has community supported agriculture and olives, but people just shook their heads here. There's so specifically it was Salt Spring, but there's so little produced that it's sold years in advance. But do you know of anyone in Oregon that's got a community supported agriculture situation?
No, not with olives. Yeah, it's like I said, either you'd have to, of course, brine them or, have them milled or something for the oil. But no, we don't. Usually, like I said, the growers who grow olives, either they'll have like just olives or they'll also grow grapes, for wine grapes and that sort of thing. But we don't have anyone that's like a vegetable grower that would have a CSA and they have olive trees. I mean, maybe someday, but at this point, there isn't anyone that's doing that I know of.
Thank you.
All right.
So thank you all. If there's any more questions, any more? We good? All right. All right. Buonanotte tutti.
Buonanotte tutti.
Ciao.